environmental science needs to be changed. So, Henry, you need to tell, I think there's a couple more things you want to talk about, maybe some things we could do.
Sure, thank you. Folks, at this time I would like to break away from the visual presentation and talk a bit about experiences of what has brought us to this point and where we might go from here to stand up against what we now have. Please consider two words: civil disobedience. That's a concept espoused by the famous naturalist Henry David Thoreau. Should one encourage it? Well, let us take a look at the options, and I ask you to be the judge. We are faced now quite dramatically with the presence of Plan 2014. Some of us might never have expected it to arrive at our doors. And yet, how did it actually come about? Is Plan 2014 the cause of the flooding and catastrophic conditions that we have seen along the lakeshore? And if so, how do we really make it go away? The International Joint Commission has continually claimed, in the news and otherwise, that the cause of the high water, flooding, and resulting damages that we have seen this year has not been Plan 2014, but rather Mother Nature. We can accede, as noted, to the idea that nature has brought considerable rain this year, even record amounts of rain. But we may be hard-pressed to remember record levels of snowfall this past winter. Certainly precipitation and runoff have played their roles. But there have been massive rains and record snowfalls, as noted in the past, and yet this year has been dramatically different on Lake Ontario and indeed the St. Lawrence River. And what is different this year is Plan 2014. I have been involved with water level issues on Lake Ontario since 1993. In 1990, I found a plot of land on the shore of Lake Ontario on the shore of Sodus Bay, as I noted. And for a very brief period in my life, I found that I could afford to buy a modest lakefront property. In 1991, I bought that land, and in 1992, I was able to have a very modest, rustic, yet very nice little cottage erected on it. In 1993, I was asked to join an organization known and abbreviated as LOSS, L-O-S-S, which stands for the Lake Ontario South Shore Council. And soon thereafter, I was asked to serve as its president. And since that time in 1993, I have been intensely involved in lake level issues. I want to commend this group, United Shoreline, and especially its founders and organizers, for their efforts and their initial successes in working to band together property owners along the Lake Ontario shoreline and beachfront associations with a desire to stand up to and against the circumstances wreaking havoc along these shores. For years, the Lake Ontario South Shore Council did and has done this, seeking to band shoreline property owners together to speak with a shared voice and to address the actions of the IJC and the St. Lawrence River Board of Control in their regulation of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River under the prior regulation plan, Plan 1958 DD. With no office or staff, I and other members of LOSS would repeatedly draft and print lengthy newsletters which we would seek to provide by hand, driving along the lakeshore roadways and delivering the newsletters to property owners' doors, telling of current issues and urgent collective efforts. Typically, relying on membership contributions, we might spend $1,000 on the printing of a newsletter, replenish a similar amount through contributions generated from that effort, and hope to be ready when issues demanded to print and distribute another newsletter. Continually, we would speak out on behalf of lakeshore dwellers and property owners' interests at public meetings of the Army Corps of Engineers and the St. Lawrence River Board of Control. And as we work toward coalescence of interest to create a network of representatives from beach locations and shorefront organizations along the lakeshore, we found it extremely difficult and quite frustrating, frankly, as people's interests in staying with the cause copacetically lessened when water levels comfortably dropped. Now, with no signs of water levels comfortably dropping, it would be nonsense for lakeshore property owners to stay away from this cause. For what we need now is what is evident in this room and what needs to be occurring all along the lakeshore: unification, an ability to speak with a strong, unified, collective, and single voice. As I mentioned, I've been at this effort a long time, seeking to stand up against the powerful interests which regulate the water levels in Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. And during these 24 years of efforts, I've continually observed how strong and powerful, moneyed, and well-funded everyone else involved is, except the lakeshore riparians. So many non-lakeshore dwellers, offering or venting criticism, choose to claim that we lakeshore property owners are all just so wealthy. So apparently, one should think that we are all moneyed, well-funded, and financially equipped to stand collectively or individually against the onslaught of those who would wish to bring high water to and against us. Yet we are not so well equipped, or if we are, the collective joinder to fund intensive lobbying efforts on our behalf has never quite been adequate. Clearly, the other stakeholder interests have effective, overt, or covert lobbying efforts and the financial means to support them. Shipping, as we know, is a mega million-dollar or even mega billion-dollar industry with massive resources to assert their interests. Hydropower as well. The environmental interests are able to rely on resources gained through charitable contributions, as entities such as the Nature Conservancy strongly assert their desires. Even when seemingly grassroots, the environmental entities have well-funded offices, staffs, and budgets for their cause. For years, the environmental group called Save the River has had its office, albeit small, in Clayton, New York. Where, one might ask, is there an actual office funded to be dedicated to the interests and plights of the lakefront property owner along Lake Ontario? While the environmental lobby seems to have gained victory with Plan 2014, it might be asked whether that victory would have been achieved without considerable help from a government entity, most particularly, as noted, the involvement of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC. For decades, it has been rumored that the agenda of the DEC has been to succeed in wiping property owners' homes and cottages off of the New York State shores of Lake Ontario, with the land thereafter to become public lands of New York State. Some within our collective efforts have even stated that they have heard officials state this intention. Yet how could it really be so, one might ask? And yet now we have Plan 2014. Plan 2014, created, as noted, by a committee meeting behind closed doors without public involvement or scrutiny, and apparently dominated by representatives of environmental concerns, and especially representatives of the New York State DEC. And so again, how did we get to this point? And what do we do now? Many of us may recall that in the 1990s, there was high water on Lake Ontario a few, if not several times. I recall high water particularly in 1993, and then again in 1997, and even 1998. Not as high as we have had this year, but nevertheless perilously high. Those circumstances, of course, as noted, were under the prior plan of regulation, Plan 1958 DD. and plenty of lakeshore property owners were complaining then, as frequently, about the conditions under that Plan 58DD. Through the IJC, a change in regulation was proposed that I believe was called Plan 1997, and public hearings were rolled out about that proposal. And quite stridently and vociferously, the public shot that plan down, particularly as it seemed that it would create worse conditions than under Plan 58DD. So leading up to the year 2000, the IJC then announced that it had gained funding for a $20 million 5-year study to examine whether or not a plan of regulation could be adopted that was better than Plan 58DD. That study, known as the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Study, began in 2000 and was to be funded through 2005. And among the supposed beauties of that study was that all stakeholder interests would be involved in the study process, including shoreline and riverfront property owner interests, recreational boating interests, and environmental interests, as well as commercial navigation and shipping, hydropower, and municipal water intake and discharge interests. Of greatest beauty, it seemed, was that the public was to be integrally involved in the process internally and from the beginning, rather than to be addressed only through public hearings after plan formulation had occurred. Along with the study board, consisting of 6 individuals from the US and 6 from Canada, the board known as the Public Interest Advisory Group, abbreviated PIAG, was formed by the IJC. The PIAG, to be comprised of 12 people from the US and 12 from Canada, was formed not as a decision-making group, but to be a conduit of information from the public to the study, and of information from the internal workings of the study to the public. Well, it seemed quite wonderful, actually, transparency with the public to be included and involved from the beginning. I, along with Tony McKenna and a few others from the area, including Dan Barletta, were designated to be members of the Public Interest Advisory Group. And we served on that group throughout the years of the study, even as it continued for a few years past 2005. And so, throughout that period of time, we traveled extensively for meetings to localities around the water basin, including Ottawa, Toronto, Niagara Falls, Cornwall, Messina, Ogdensburg, and St. Catharines, as well as Washington, D.C., believing that each of us was working very hard to represent the public's interests with regard to the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Study. I will tell you that on at least a few occasions, I began to wonder if we were quite being co-opted, as I began to observe that some of those meetings were being scheduled and held at the very same time as public meetings of the Army Corps of Engineers and the St. Lawrence River Board of Control were being held elsewhere, thus keeping some of us who had been more vocal lakeshore property owners from speaking out, as we had long done at those public meetings. And to our concern, as we would listen at study board meetings, we began to hear pronouncements that Plan 1958DD had long provided benefits to property owners along Lake Ontario, that whatever plan was ultimately to be proposed, it would inevitably cause damages to the south shores of Lake Ontario, both to protected properties and particularly to unprotected lands. That those damages were to be labeled less as damages and more as, quote, reductions in benefits. And that in any event, there would be no mitigation against or compensation for those damages or reductions in benefits, as neither the IJC nor any related government entities had funds to provide such mitigation or compensation. When any of us spoke up to counter or challenge such viewpoints and statements, it often felt like we were being viewed as having 3 or more heads. And despite our efforts to question or challenge the science on which presumptions and decisions were moving forward within the study, and to assert that valuations of property were being skewed as working groups within the study sought to minimize the values to be placed on damages to dwellings, structures, break walls, and lands, adequate adjustments in such valuations were never made. As the study was concluding, the study board made recommendations to the IJC as to formulation of a new regulatory plan. And the IJC rolled out to the public at numerous public hearings its first proposed plan resulting from the study. At this point, without looking back, I cannot recall all of the names, but at one point a plan called Plan 2007 was proposed. And at another point, a plan called Plan BV7 was put forth. In each instance, at the public hearings, the proposed plans met with strong negative reaction from the public. Perhaps some of you or many of you here were at some of these public meetings. And yet, despite that negative reaction, the U.S. chairperson of the IJC at one point wrote to the sitting U.S. Secretary of State, indicating that one of those such plans had universal support and almost no negative review. As we waited in fear for a pronouncement that such would be the new regulation plan, we heard nothing, and we began to hope that the IJC and the Department of State would ultimately push forward no change that would be adverse to us. Only after a new presidential administration and the eventual selection of new U.S. IJC Commission members did it seem that we were not to be free and clear. And as the Lake Ontario-St. Lawrence River study was truly beyond being at an end, and it seemed that the IJC, Commission members and staff, had not achieved what they evidently wished, a working group was formed, as noted, to meet behind closed doors without true public involvement, and that is the group staffed with representatives of environmental interests that ultimately put forth Plan 2014. As noted, that plan was not a plan that came out of the International Lake Ontario-St. Lawrence River study. It disproportionately hurts the New York State, Lake Shore, and shoreline of Lake Ontario, leaving the Canadian shoreline, as agreed upon, either without damages or far less damaged. As noted, perhaps that is why we understand that people in Canada have hardly really become aware of Plan 2014. The plan has been put in place with no inclusion of mitigation or compensation to address the losses and damages which it will cause and it's already caused. The plan has far deflated the valuations of the losses and damages. The plan has been adopted without transparency and fair stakeholder and public input. And of crucial importance, as noted, by eliminating Plan 1958 DD's Criterion K and by the substitution of the ineffective trigger levels which continually move, the plan has eliminated that opportunity for and the ability of the River Board of Control, who is the day-to-day regulator of this lake and river system, to provide the necessary deviations to water flows to help avoid disaster being caused to the lake and river waterfronts. And if you think that the public has really been involved in the ultimate decision-making process leading up to all this, perhaps you might instead adopt the view of the situation from the perspective of a lakefront property owner who has been lulled comatose by IJC presentations to await a chance to be heard and listened to at IJC public meetings, only to never get the chance to speak or to be cut off by commission members acting in the interests of the expediency of their own time concerns. And so here we are with a new plan passed through the IJC and the State Department of the outgoing U.S. presidential administration in the last month of that administration and after creation totally behind closed doors that did not ever open for the public. And now we should ask, what do we do? The trouble is, so many things that we might wish to do, actions we might wish to take, would seem to be futile. Some people say, sue the IJC. And some government entities, such as the town of Greece and the village of Sodas Point, a few months ago enacted resolutions urging their respective counties, Monroe and Wayne, to sue the IJC and or to take all possible legal action to work to negate Plan 2014. That is all very nice as a grandstanding gesture, and it might even be commendable. But the fact is that the IJC is, and long has been, immune from suit. Not that I know so much, but I've been on television a good bit stating that circumstance that the IJC is immune from suit. And weeks later, the town attorneys for the town of Greece provided their fine legal research that the IJC was immune from suit and could not be successfully sued. That immunity falls under the umbrella of diplomatic immunity. And sadly, it is a bit like being run over by the son of an ambassador or embassy staff member driving an embassy car in Washington, D.C., and finding that that person, or the car owner, is free and clear from suit. In fact, the entity of which I have been president, the Lake Ontario South Shore Council, years before I was involved, in the 1980s, and one of the other members who may have been involved at that time, Bill Mayer is here, head of Mayer Marina, that entity sued the government over circumstances relating to flooding on Lake Ontario. But then, too, they were unable to successfully name the IJC as a defendant, and instead they sued the Army Corps of Engineers as representative of the U.S. government and the New York State Power Authority as representative of the government of the state of New York. Here, I frankly suggest neither of those entities is the cohort in crime. And yet, crime, it really is. Even if one did to try to commence a civil lawsuit, such would be extremely costly. And government attorneys would undoubtedly paper the plaintiffs to total loss of funds, ultimately to succeed with dismissal of a lawsuit, as has happened in many civil actions against the Army Corps of Engineers elsewhere in the country. Indeed, the lawsuit brought by the Lake Ontario South Shore Council created $86,000 in legal fees for the firm of Harder, Seacrest, and Emmer, only to be paid by a settlement in which little was achieved, but for payment of $25,000 toward the plaintiff's legal fees by the Army Corps of Engineers, payment of $25,000 toward the plaintiff's legal fees by the New York State Power Authority, thus supplementing the $20,000 state earmark that an assemblyman who was an uncle of one of the attorneys managed to secure for that law firm to even consider the suit, thus leaving $16,000 to be raised among Lakeshore property owners. And what was gained by that suit but a pronouncement that a Lakeshore waterfront property owner has the right to sue the government for flooding, erosion, and loss of property as an unconstitutional taking of property under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution without just compensation. A nice pronouncement, but quite ineffective without resources to assert that right and/or a non-immune defendant to sue. The question arises as to whether the immunity of the IJC extends to criminal prosecution, though. And I have asserted on television news and elsewhere that it may be an open question at least worthy of having some taxpayer-funded prosecutor consider making a good name for himself or herself by publicly contemplating bringing that action. At least criminal prosecution would not bankrupt our wallets and pocketbooks. And since the IJC commissioners made their decision to enact Plan 2014, knowing that it would cause and/or would fail to protect against the damages that have occurred, and thus with the specific intent to cause or allow those damages to occur, I respectfully have argued that a crime has occurred and is occurring. To be quite frank, I have not met any individuals whom I perceive more deserving of the label criminal than the most recent commissioners of the IJC. And yet, I have noted my views to the Wayne County District Attorney's Office and the Office of the New York State Attorney General, and I have not heard any interest or seen any bravery put forth on their account. Perhaps a legal action seeking an injunction against the IJC and the River Board of Control to halt the further implementation of Plan 2014 might have some possibility, at least as an action contained in a brief period of time, as opposed to a years-long legal battle. But again, money talks, and it is difficult to find attorneys who would or could take the case on for little retainer or without being sunk in the process. Meanwhile, we might wish to hope for the help of politicians and elected officials. But with due respect to a few such officials who are here and really seem to care and want to help with these issues, many politicians only seem to want to grandstand for self-aggrandizement or to show up when it suits their own purposes, if they even wish to get involved at all. And so we carry on, trying to put the word out as to how critical these issues are, working as the Lake Ontario Riparian Alliance, abbreviated LORA, also does, to bring attention to the cause. I'm pleased to be a director of LORA, along with Tony McKenna, Dan Barletta of Greece, Jack Steinkamp of Sodas Point, and Jim Jerome of Watertown. And I and Dan Barletta are now on our 86th edited issue of The Leveler, which you may have seen, trying to keep people up to date about these issues. But what do we do when all or such seems futile? When we try the legal routes, the public advocacy and lobbying routes, the co-opting and pseudo-inclusion routes, and nothing seems to work, what do we do? Do we resort to civil disobedience? Do we stand up peaceably to authority with a willingness to take a risk? I'm not advocating it, I'm just raising the question. For I know that it goes to the very principles of action on which our country was founded. I also know, however, that forces now work in ways that can shut down such assertive action before such ever gets started. If you have any clear-headed, rational, peaceable theories as to how to stand up against authority, to protest, and to be effectively heard and listened to, please let us know. We want to be very careful not to rabble-rouse. Sit-ins, peace demonstrations, maybe things of the past perhaps, but they have had a place and have been effective. It is really wonderful to see such a large group of people here in collaborative and shared desire to stand up for our rights as lakefront property owners. The need for our shared voice is critical, for we face such enormous damages and potential for future damages now. In the past, our voice and the level of property owners' interests have ebbed, flowed, and waned as conditions have gone from critical to acceptable and comfortable. Nothing under Plan 2014 is acceptable or comfortable. Our voices need to be heard, shared, and in unison. Please don't go home and go away from demonstrating interest in this fight. It is a fight, and if we do not win, our properties will be lost. Please, I urge you to stay with the fight. I thank you very much.